Welcome to the Apogee Up Close webcast. We do these twice a month. The topics are based on popular demand. You can sign up multiple times, and you can ask questions live. Hi, I'm Keith Daniken. I'm a customer engineer with Apogee, part of Google Cloud Platform. Today we're going to look at the top 10 tips to help you have a better API program in the new year. So if you're going to put together a checklist of things you should do to make sure you have a successful API program in 2019, what will be on your list? I've been talking with my colleagues at Apogee about their suggestions, and I put together a list of the top 10 suggestions. They fell roughly under three categories: process tips, product tips, and infrastructure and DevOps tips. So let's get started. I'm going to start with 4 topics on improving your process. So number 1, think outside in. If you've attended an Apogee webcast before, you've probably seen this. It's core to how we think about how API management should work. It's worth taking another look in the context of this webcast. We've seen a repeated pattern of success with our customers, and it's driven by how they think about the API problem. It requires a shift in thinking. Traditionally, we think about services from an exposure point of view. We can just expose a service and be finished, but thinking about it from the end user's point of view leads to better results. Our successful customers start with the user, thinking about what that user's experience will be like, and working backwards from there. Providing application developers with great APIs reduces the complexity of creating new applications. The developer is free to focus on user experience and iterate on a few different designs. The API team makes this possible by providing an easy-to-use API with consistent interfaces and security. The API team builds the API facades on the existing services, abstracting away the complexity. This makes it easy to build great APIs that are easy to use. So keep this pattern in mind when you build your APIs. Tip number 2. Develop an API product mindset. So APIs are not one-off products, but products that need continuous iteration and development. So focus on that life cycle. So what does it mean to productize an API? There's many aspects we might talk about, but we find it helpful to focus on these 3 items: outside in, speed to market, and iterative delivery. Might help to look at an example. Let's look at how Walgreens talks about their API products. They've got a bunch of different API products, and they're split into all these different categories that you see on the slide here. This is very deliberate in terms of how they package these and how they manage them and things like that. So Walgreens says that their API products are managed like any other product within their digital product portfolio. There are a few keys to success for what that looks like. They have a product roadmap for APIs and present it quarterly to their entire digital product team, partners, business teams, marketing, and other key stakeholders. So there is great visibility into what they're doing, and it's a great source of opportunity and partnership with other teams. Second thing, they have a fantastic developer evangelist, and he actually sits within the product team. So the partnership with the product managers is very strong. Next, they have great tools to engage with their developer community and manage their API program. They have a developer portal, which is the initial entry point to their APIs. And of course, they have Apogee, which allows them to be a great partner to their developer community. And last but definitely not least, they put a big focus, as with any other product, on defining what success looks like and reporting out their performance against those metrics. So another tip is to create an API product manager role. That's somebody who's going to manage APIs across the entire life cycle. They're going to take that vision and turn it into action, and they're a subject matter expert. So tip number 3, focus on the application developer. So why are API developers so important? API consumer adoption is key to success for any API program. APIs will need to be marketed to API consumers as products, not just as raw services. Application developers are your ultimate consumers. So keep them in mind when you're developing your API program. You may have different types of application developers who will have different requirements for your APIs. For example, you might have internal application developers, partners application developers, and external application developers, all building different things, all with different wants and needs when it comes to your API program. Shutterstock is creating a great developer experience by answering the most important questions that arise during development and creating a great getting started and onboarding experience. So imagine that you're an API consumer, you're an application developer, and you go to their website. This is great. It's got everything you need to get started, and they've reduced the amount of friction, encouraging people to develop things. So tip number 4, pick an MVBO. Where do you start with your API project? Choosing an MVBO is a great place to start. So what is an MVBO? An MVBO is a minimum viable business outcome. It's a small yet business critical delivery that showcases the opportunity and starts building ongoing delivery momentum. So how do you pick a good MVBO? The MVBO should focus on creating milestones for business enablement and pave the path for others to follow in. And the MVBO should be ready it should be engaging, and it should be sufficiently difficult. Let's look at each of those in a bit more detail. So ready means that the project you pick can get into production quickly and demonstrate value. Speed's going to be essential here. So that means you should avoid complex program or delivery dependencies, avoid target backend systems that require significant refactoring, avoid use cases where the user base or customer demand does not already exist. It should be engaging. So make sure your project is engaging. You need to deliver something of clear business value and impact aligned to strategic goals and sponsor interest. It should deliver strategic value, deliver business value. It should resonate with your audience, and it should create a pathway for repeatable success. Your MVBO should be sufficiently difficult. The APIs delivered should not just be pass-throughs. They should be complex enough to demonstrate key API management benefits, including controlled access to resources and assets, analytics, self-service consumption via a developer portal, and they should demonstrate how they'll scale. So consider all those things when you're thinking about an MVBO. Next, let's look at 3 tips in the product category. So number 5, standardize the security. Backend services often have different protocols for authentication, depending on when they were developed. Navigating those multiple security protocols causes extra work for API consumers. Consider standardizing the security you present to your API consumers. They'll be much happier and they'll thank you for this. An API platform can help you standardize your security. In addition to policies for authentication, there's policies for rate limiting and quotas, payload protection, and more. Your API platform can control access to protected resources to help you with compliance also. You may need to tie into an existing identity management system. This is an example of a flow that generates an OAuth token after users enter their passwords. The authentication flow makes a call out to the identity system to verify the user's username and password. And if the credentials are accepted, it returns a token to the application that is then sent to the business flow. So, simple example of how you might integrate with an existing identity management system. Number 6, measure, monitor, and improve. So, how do you improve your API program? Measuring how applications call it and monitoring the performance will help you know what needs to be tuned and give you data on how your program is doing. So after you've built a few APIs and your application developers have discovered them and started to send you traffic, it'd be great if you could measure your API program. The analytics system in Apigee Edge allows you to measure every aspect of your API traffic. You can measure operational details like response time, frequency of different types of errors. You can find things that are interesting to your business, like where are people located when they call your APIs, or which applications are sending the most traffic. Maybe it's interesting to see what type of client they're using. Are they on Internet Explorer? Are they on Chrome? Are they on different mobile platforms? All of these things can be answered with analytics reports. So, what should you be measuring? Here's a list of some of the common metrics that we've heard from customers that they find valuable. So think about the number of APIs, the number of developers, the number of customers, the number of partners, the number of apps, the speed to API, speed to onboard, so in other words, how long does it take to get up and going, traffic growth, business breadth, cost reduction, direct revenue, and net promoter score. Apigee has some great reports to help you understand your API program. For example, here is an engagement report that shows you how many developers are using your platform and their level of engagement. So one final important aspect of operating an API platform is ensuring the availability of your APIs. Apigee launched an API monitoring product a couple weeks ago, freely available now to all cloud-based Enterprise Edge customers. So please check that out. So number 7, get the right value from your APIs. The value generated by APIs does not typically come from charging for API calls. Most of the value comes from business opportunities enabled by the APIs and the applications that use them. Make sure your APIs deliver value either directly or indirectly. Consider measuring your rate of innovation or your time to app. While an API may not directly generate revenue, what value does it bring if you can create applications in a month instead of a year? Can APIs provide you with new sources of value? Do you have unique data that might be valuable to others? Can you charge for it? What new channels of business can you explore? AccuWeather is able to monetize their data by packaging it into different offerings with different price points. So think of approaches for how you might want to do this. Next, let's shift to infrastructure and DevOps. I have 4 tips in this category. Tip number 8, automate and integrate. The UI is great, but automation is even better. Most users start off with the UI, but they'll move to automating parts of their processes. Apogee has a great set of management APIs that allow you to automate every aspect of the platform. Take a look at the reference docs and start exploring these. I've got the URL on the screen here. The Apogee community is a great place to find advice and resources for CI/CD automation. There's a lot of people who've gone through this before you, and there's links to tools and discussion of how to use them. Number 9, grow with microservices. Microservices enable developers to build and deploy software with speed, agility, and scale necessary to meet the needs of your business. You can decompose a monolithic application into a set of services that can be developed and released independently. Microservices are an architecture approach to software development where software is composed of small independent services that communicate over well-defined APIs. Microservices enable modern enterprises to create a flexible architecture where services can be versioned, deployed, and scaled without impact to the other systems or applications. So the great thing about microservices is that they can easily grow with your business, but that comes with some new complexities. An app development team may rush to implement microservices, and when they do this, they inadvertently create silos with inconsistencies in security, visibility, documentation, and governance. Many of the APIs that connect microservices are not secured consistently across the organization. So these microservices and associated APIs are often difficult to reuse, analyze, or even to discover for use by other teams. You can solve this problem by managing the consumption of your microservices with your API platform. So number 10, let's talk about cloud migration. Migrating to the cloud isn't a straight path. Enterprises adopt different paths to define their cloud strategy. Often enterprises will pick multiple paths based on different projects or workloads. So there's 3 key takeaways from this slide. Migration paths will vary even within a company and across applications. Migrations are not instant. Some take months or even years. Across all the paths of migration, API management can play a key role in making integrations easier. So how can API management help? So a few different things to look at here. Apogee can help with many of these different challenges. Service connectivity. One of the primary concerns of app migration is tight coupling of the clients or user experiences to the backend services or apps. Apogee acts as an abstraction layer between the exposure and consumption, allowing for service connectivity while parts of the app's backend or front end are migrated to the cloud. Security enforcement. Apogee can act both as a security enforcement layer as well as a security mediation layer. As apps are modernized while moving to the cloud, it's very common for the modern apps to have a different security mechanism like JWT or OAuth versus the legacy traditional backends like SAML, Basic Auth, etc. Apogee can bring in uniformity by allowing the modern apps to use one common mechanism while mediating the credentials while talking to the legacy backends and vice versa. Apogee can also make sure that security mechanisms like regex checks, DLP enforcement are done while on-prem apps that have strict compliance needs are calling the cloud workloads. For visibility, by acting as the facade across on-prem, GCP workloads, Apogee can provide visibility into how app migrations are happening and the success or traction for the migrated apps. The API metrics that Apogee provides are slightly higher level, as Apogee will have visibility into which apps, developer, or clients are calling your API, which API product is being used to call the API, and etc. The API metrics can be pulled in through Apogee's management API and analyzed along with other operational metrics collected by the app's logging framework, etc. API facades. So most often, not all of the apps can be migrated at once. The replatformed or modernized apps will have to talk to a monolith or a legacy or traditional backend. These backends most of the time will be in legacy protocols like SOAP XML. It's not ideal for modern apps to consume them that way. And it adds the additional burden of maintaining additional libraries, making the app heavier and complex. Apogee can help create API facades that are modern while keeping the monolith intact. The replatformed or modern apps can talk to these facades instead of going directly to the backend. And finally, service management. Lift and modernization is one of the standard themes of app migration. Microservices, often on Kubernetes, is a vehicle for app modernization. As enterprises realize the success of microservices-based architectures, the number of microservices explodes and the apps are migrated to cloud without the right security and visibility. It's extremely difficult to accelerate the adoption of microservices. Some enterprises are already already looking at Istio to solve this problem, for customers who have adopted Istio, Apogee can provide enterprise support for non-GCP Istio implementations, as well as add the higher-level API management aspects like OAuth through the Mixer adapter. For customers who are not looking at Istio, example, customers who are on PCF, Apogee's microgateway can add similar capabilities and manage their microservices like security and analytics. So that's the top 10 list. Next up, let's take some questions. Okay, let's start off with the first question. Where should I start with the management APIs? How can they be used to automate my deployment? So take a look at the reference section of the API documentation for Apogee. And in there, you'll see a list of all of those. Pick one or two and play with it and just get a feel for how it works. One thing people will commonly do is automate the deployment process. So meaning if you're going to push something, for example, from dev to test or from maybe tests or QA into production, you can automate that. So take a look at the management API specifically around that area and give that a try. Next question has to deal with analytics and measuring your APIs. And the question there is, how can I measure something business specific with a custom report in Apogee? So there's a statistics collector policy in there. The statistics collector policy lets you grab anything that's a variable in Apogee. So anything from the request to the response or anything you want to extract out of there, you can save that as a custom metric, and that can be used in the reporting system. So you can combine that with the built-in analytics, build a custom report, and measure something that's interesting. So think about what you might want to measure with that. Okay, next question. You touched on experience APIs. What is an experience API? So think of an experience as an application or how somebody would experience your services. So a lot of times we'll build custom services just for a particular application. Like you might have an experience API to support a mobile application. And what's nice about having an API platform for this is it lets you easily build a custom API that's specific to the experience that you're trying to share. So next one in here is a question about getting started with using APIs for consuming microservices. So what are the best practices and how do you get started with this? So I'm going to go back to that outside-in type of thinking. So think about how we want to control how people experience these microservices. A great place to put Apogee is right on top of those microservices, and it would be used to control access for external consumers. So put Apogee in there and treat the backend like you would any other backend, only it's going to be microservices in this case. So what about measuring the number of active subscriptions? That's a great idea. So that is a good metric to measure. So you could do that through some of the built-in reports that are in Apogee. There's a developer engagement one that will show you who's subscribed and what they're doing and things like that. There's a question in here where the listener missed some bits of authentication. What's the best way to integrate with vendors like Okta, SSO for OAuth, or Abstract from end users? So there's a great webcast out there that you may have seen last year. Take a look out on the YouTube channel for Apogee. I've got another webcast out there that just deals with that topic. So basically, there are policies inside of Apogee that will generate OAuth tokens. And what you'll do is the generation of that token, if you just put that in your flow, it's just going to generate a token. Typically what people will do is they're going to put some logic in front of that to generate, or not to generate, to call out to the identity management system and verify the user in some way. And then if and only if they're good, will they generate the token. So that's the general pattern in there. But there's a whole webcast on that. Take a look on the YouTube channel, and you'll see under the Apogee Up Close series, there is a webcast just covering that topic. There's a question in here, transitioning to the API world is disruptive to existing internal dev community. What tips can you give for elevating internal dev community learning? How best to promote and encourage? So I would explore why is it disruptive to move to the API world, and what is it about that? Some of the things we'd focus on is what's the onboarding process for APIs? So is it easier if you have an API management platform in place? Is there a developer portal where they can go and find examples and things like that? So it should be something the developers are excited about, and it should be something that can be done in a way that it's not too disruptive. So explore where the friction is in there and work on that. So what best describes the attributes of an API or a digital team? So we'll rephrase this as kind of who's on that team or what they're doing. So when you're first getting started, this might be a smaller team. There might be people on there who are going to be building APIs. And those might be people who built web services in the past, or at least they have a knowledge of what the backend services are and can look at those and figure out what to expose. Over time, we'd like to add an API product manager because we want to think about these things as products, manage their life cycle, and things like that. So that's going to be somebody who's a little bit more business focused. You may have some people on there who are viewing reports and measuring things. They'd probably fall under that product manager role also. You may have some people in there who are going to be consuming these APIs, but the team varies quite a bit. You'll find a lot of different people on the API team. There's a question here for enterprises with B2B partners. Can Apogee play an outbound API call management role? Management of calls originating from inside. So yeah, we do see this. So the pattern here is that you can manage any kind of API call. So maybe you're calling out or maybe you're receiving calls coming in. Either way, you can think of this as a good place to have API management if you want to be able to measure that traffic, if you want to be able to control it, reshape requests and things like that. You can use it for inside calls or for outside calls, and whether you're calling in or out. Question here is there such a thing as a private internal API? If yes, how is it treated differently? So private or internal API, I might think of that as an experience API. And really, the only thing that's going to make it private versus public is how you choose to expose it and who has access to it and who can use it. But we see this commonly. We'll see people have completely, big internal API programs at their companies where they're developing all these things and none of it's exposed externally. So yeah, that's a very common use case. Next question, can Apogee support custom transformations? Also, does Apogee support API orchestration? So for custom transformations, yes, very much so. So we have built-in transformations in there for JSON to XML, XML to JSON. You can also use XSLT in there if you're working with XML. And there's support for using different languages in there for custom policies. So Java, JavaScript, and Python can be used, and they have complete control over the request and the response flow. So one thing that's very common is you might write a little bit of JavaScript or Java code in there, and that would transform the response that comes back. That's a common use case. On the second side of that, can Apogee support API orchestration? Yes, that's a common use case. So you're going to have one call in, and then you might call 2 or 3 different services on the back end, collect those responses, and orchestrate them. So yeah, you can do that. There's direct callouts to do that if you want to do it synchronously. If you want to do it asynchronously, you can do it with some of the built-in programming languages for the custom policies. The question here is a response to the other one. Thank you for clarifying on experience APIs. How does it work with API facades? Do they complement or supplement each other? So an experience API is really something that's custom built to support a particular application. A facade, I would describe as what you're doing is you're hiding away the complexities of the enterprise. So you're separating the external interface from the internal implementation of that API. So think about how would you ideally like to have this API look to the outside world and build an interface that looks like that. And then map that to the internal services. And that can be done in a number of different ways. But really, the difference between these two is the intention. Are we building this for a specific use, or is this just a general purpose way to improve and simplify how our API is to call? How do you demonstrate the value of API-driven architecture within an enterprise if they're happy with an ESB-led architecture? Yeah, that's a tough one. So I would say once they get to see something like this, they would absolutely love it. If I'm thinking old school ESB style architecture, where this would be better is think about how long does it take you to develop an application? So if you wanted to write a new single page web application or a new mobile application, what's that process like and how long does it take to do something like that? Also, where's the documentation? Is there a developer portal today that has everything somebody would be on there? What's the process for a developer to onboard? So those are a few things to look at that might help with that. Can you map existing microservices to Apogee? How can you achieve that? So yeah, you sure can. So think about it like the back end is going to be a set of microservices. So you're going to build a facade on top of that, build a proxy in Apogee, and that will talk to those various back end systems. Okay, a few more questions coming in. What's my opinion on API versioning?
putting the version at the level of the path or the content. So this is one of those things that's very contentious in the API world. How do you do versioning? I've seen many different ways to do this. The most common I have seen, and the advice that we tend to give, is put the version in the URL. So and keep it as far to the left as possible. So that's the most common we see. I've seen it done in headers, though. I've seen it done in a number of different ways, but that's the most common that I'm seeing. Does Apogee Istio replace existing middleware integration and adapter technologies? Istio would help you manage a set of microservices. Sometimes those microservices might be replacing internal technologies. Sometimes they might be supplementing them. I'm seeing a lot of folks do microservices for new projects, and they would be complementary or supplemental to existing things that are in place. Okay, I'm going to take a few more questions, and then we'll move on to a poll. Thank you for all the questions. I've got a lot of them in here. There's a question in here: is there a way to onboard an API developer manually? Currently, the developer subscription is done automatically. I have a use case where I want to do some verification before granting the subscription. Is this possible? So yes, it is. You can check in Apogee, you can set up that it's going to be done manually, and then you can go into the dashboard where you approve apps, and you would have to approve it in there. It can also be done through an API. Okay, I'll take two more, and then we'll wrap up. Can Apogee leverage cloud functions or use a cloud function as the backend API source? Can it use PubSub for queuing? So yes, absolutely. So a few different ways to do this. We've got some connectors that are in Apogee for Google Cloud Platform. So if you're working on Google Cloud Platform, you'll find built-in support for this. If you happen to be working on AWS or another cloud, check our documentation for that. There are some examples of doing Lambda functions, or in other cases, as long as something has an API or that can be connected to through HTTP, this is going to be pretty easy to do. What's the preferred approach to restrict access to APIs protected by Apogee, so traffic must go through Apogee first? Firewall rules, TLS certificates, how do we do that? So yes, firewall rules and TLS certificates would be two ways to do that, but basically some form of cutting off access that doesn't go through Apogee, and that's typically done through networking techniques. All right, our next webcast coming up on January 17th is Hybrid Apps, Migration and Modernization, and the Need for API Management. Thank you for attending today, and Happy New Year to everyone out there from everyone at Apogee.